Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Fish. I'm the Executive Director of Canadian Business for Social Responsibility, and today is the Humane Economy, Farm Animal Welfare, and the Market Drivers. Broadcasting live today from the Canadian Invent Trade Center in downtown Toronto, and we have a number of stakeholders with us joining from the east to the west coast of Canada, and we have some folks down in the U.S. as well. So thank you for joining us online. We have a diverse group here in Toronto, although a slightly smaller group that will be leading the discussion. This is the second of a series of events that we've hosted in partnership with World Animal Protection. We did a session that was much more sort of high level, what issues for business in animal welfare today. We chose this year to look a little bit more purposefully at the market itself and what's driving the market, what's changing the market. Are companies seeing an impact on their bottom line? Are investors looking at this carefully? Are analysts and assessors looking at animal welfare and criteria? And the answer is yes, and at varying levels, and we'll hear from all of those stakeholders today. So as far as the structure of the day itself, we're going to have 4 distinct presentations, and I'll introduce everyone now, and then I'll let everyone's presentation sort of run its course. First off, we have Dr. Rory Sullivan, who's the expert advisor on the business benchmark on farm animal welfare. Rory has lots of titles next to his name. He's a senior research fellow with the University of Leeds. Is previously the head of responsible investment at Insight Management, and is a strategic advisor for Ethics SRA Advisors, and is of course the expert advisor on the business benchmark development as well. We also have with us today Fawn Jackson, who is the director of the Sustainable Beef, and is also the managing director. Let me just get the title right here. I'm flipping between applications. I apologize. Sorry. Is the manager of environment and sustainability for the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. So Fawn's joining us today from Calgary. So I have Dr. Greg Douglas, who's the VP of Animal Welfare for Maple Leaf Foods. Welcome to Douglas. And last but not least, Michelle de Cordova joining us via WebEx from Vancouver, who will talk about the investment drivers and what her organization, NEI Investments, is seeing in the animal welfare space, and perhaps why she's interested in the subject today as well. So we're going to start off with Rory. Everyone's getting 15 minutes to speak, and then some are using presentation, some are not. And then we'll take a pause to take questions both online and from those of us that are in the room here in Toronto, and try to answer as many of those questions as possible, and hopefully be wrapped up by about 2:15 today. So we'll get things started with Rory. Thank you. Turn that on. Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen, and good afternoon, everybody. My presentation is essentially going to do 2 things. The first is I'm going to talk a little bit about the business benchmark for farm animal welfare, which is, sorry, my phone's just being adjusted. Okay, let's try that. So I'll do 2 things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the business benchmark on farm animal welfare, which is a benchmark designed for investors to understand farm animal welfare and its investment implications. And I'm then in the second part of my presentation going to offer some more general reflections around how investors see animal welfare and how they use tools like benchmarking in their investment processes. By way of preamble, I think it's fair to say that investors haven't historically paid very much attention to animal welfare. There are a variety of reasons. It's not material. It's seen as one of those niche SRI issues. It's not very important. It's seen an issue that's technically complex. It involves multiple species. For each of those species has unique characteristics, which mean that the welfare issues are different. So it is complex, and I think I would say it's probably fair to say that other than in situations where there's been a corporate crisis or corporate scandal, investors have preferred not to focus very much attention on the issue and just to leave it to companies to manage. Second sort of comment I would offer is that the organizations that sponsor the business benchmark on farm animal welfare, that is World Animal Protection and Compassion in World Farming, they both engage directly with companies and encourage companies to improve their management of animal welfare and improve the performance outcomes for the animals in their care. Both organizations have recognized the influence investors can bear. They recognize investors allocate capital, debt and finance to companies. And they also recognize that investors influence corporate practice, as the owners or investors in companies can exert influence on how companies manage these issues. I think those NGOs have also recognized that they're probably not best placed to engage with investors directly. So in 2009, the two organizations conducted a scoping study to say, how do we engage with investors, what's the vehicle we can use, and how we harness investors to deliver objectives of improving the welfare of animals being farmed for food. The conclusion from that study was that the idea of a benchmark. Now, benchmarks, for those of you who work in the responsible investment industry, are actually quite a common tool. You know, they're well-established ways which investors articulate what they expect of companies and which investors use to structure their engagement with companies. And you will find that the more successful benchmarks all align with the way that SRI research houses, organizations like Sustainalytics, MSCI and so forth evaluate companies. So benchmarks are a well understood tool which have historically been very effective at improving company practice. I suppose the risks with benchmarks have been that very often they've got stuck on management processes rather than looking at performance or outcomes. And I think that's the design failing of many. And also, many benchmarks have been sort of one-off initiatives. They've been there for 1 year and then disappeared as the sponsors, be it an NGO or whoever, has moved on to other issues. So, play the clicker, or maybe I could just add the next slide, please. Thank you. So the business benchmark, it was set up to measure and evaluate company practice and performance on farm animal welfare. It focuses global food companies, so it covers broadly the 30 largest retailers, the 30 largest bars and restaurants, and the 30 largest food producers. It's 3 objectives, so could I ask for the next slide, please? First objective is to encourage transparency. One of the big issues on animal welfare has been that relatively few food companies report any information at all on how they approach the issue of animal welfare. And while for investors that isn't particularly problematic, because investors can engage with companies and can get access to information, it is a barrier to NGO or civil society engagement with companies. The second is that one of the common complaints from companies, I think quite legitimately, was that it wasn't clear what was expected of them. Companies do want to manage issues like animal welfare properly, but what they'd received from organized individuals who cared about animal welfare was a whole series of mixed messages around what good practice looked like, what acceptable outcomes were. And so the idea of a benchmark was also that it would articulate expectations. And I think the third is that, returning to the investor angle, is that the benchmark was designed to provide tools for investors to engage with companies and use their influence to encourage companies to improve their management practices. Next slide, please. There's a website, which the URL of which is on the last slide of my presentation, but essentially the benchmark provides 3 quizzes. First is an annual benchmarking of the universe of companies. So there's 80 companies or 90 companies this year. So an annual report ranking them and providing commentary on current practice on the management and reporting of farm animal welfare. The benchmark Secretariat also provides briefing notes for investors on helping them interpret and understand animal welfare issues. Also provides for investors 2-page briefing notes summarizing the strengths and weaknesses of each company's performance. Next. Benchmark evaluates companies in 4 broad areas, and these will be very familiar to the investors in the audience. It starts looking at policies, high-level commitments to animal welfare around, and high-level commitments on specific welfare issues such as companies' positions on close confinement, antibiotic use, long-distance transport, and so forth. But it doesn't stop there, because I think one of the most notable characteristics of the company society debate on animal welfare over the last few years has been how many companies have made high commitments on animal welfare, and really important commitments: the elimination of gestation crates for sows, to the reduction or elimination of close confinement, to the reduction in antibiotic use. These have been hugely important commitments. It is striking how few companies explain how they've progressed against those commitments. Have they actually delivered the outcomes they've promised? How are they proceeding towards those goals? So the benchmark does not stop at policy. It's a really important message to bring to this community. High-level policy commitments are hugely important. They're the starting point for progress, but they're only the starting point. Others, I think, are probably based on some less than satisfactory discussions of last year, are skeptical high-level policies without clarity around implementation. So the benchmark starts with policy commitments, it then is implementation, and this aligns with how companies manage issues. Who's responsible? Has the company set objectives and targets? Does it have good internal controls? Does it manage its supply chain? Does it assure its products to standards? That's the second strand of the benchmark. The third strand is it looks at innovation leadership. So are companies involved in promoting higher welfare to consumers? Are they involved in, or do they play a constructive role in public policy debates? Do they do R&D on animal welfare? And the last and probably the most significant difference between this benchmark and others that exist on sustainability issues is the emphasis on performance. The most, if I was to criticize previous work that's been done on these types of issues, I think everybody's got the process stuff right. You've done a good job of saying policy, implementation, and so on. There's no real pathway linking the processes and performance, and the business benchmark is evolving into something that's much closer to a perform-oriented benchmark. We're in the process of working out what that looks like, but that's very much the objective. Are ranked against on a set of objective criteria. The criteria are there's a methodology document and an explanation in the benchmark report of the questions and the scoring process. The assessment is based on published information only, given that the objective is to promote transparency, and companies ranked in tiers. Next, please. Apologies to those in the room because this is quite small, but essentially what we see at the moment is we see very much a pyramid shape in terms of how companies perform. We see a few very, very strong performers, and we see companies at the very early stages of implementation. Next slide, please. Now, remember, we are talking about the food industry here. The food industry's primary input is animals. If I put it that starkly. Two-thirds of the companies are global companies, so these are not companies who are under-resourced or, person operations. These are global companies. Less than two-thirds of them even have a policy on animal welfare for key input to their business, which is a damning indictment of the current play. Now, it has improved. I think we've seen the numbers for the universities we look at increase from 46 to 64% over the last couple of years. So it's progress, but I am still astounded at how little recognition there appears to be amongst companies of the importance of animal welfare. And as you'll see in the remainder of that slide, let alone on the information and the quality of information being provided and how they implement those policies and those commitments. The benchmark has played a very important role in driving change. We survey companies every year, and the benchmark, they don't say investors have been influential in improving practice. What they point to is the benchmark and the fact the benchmark is supported by investors, engaged with, well over 100 investors over the last couple of years, and a similar number of attended briefing or consultations that we've held. So the overall picture is in some ways dispiriting, in that many companies are not even at sort of stage zero on their journey towards actually managing animal welfare properly. I think an encouraging picture is it is now on investors' agenda, it's now on the corporate agenda, and we are seeing signs of progress. Sorry, please. I'm just going to move on and just offer some reflections on investor thinking on animal welfare. This is probably more for the companies and for the civil society organizations who are participating. So I apologize to the investors for telling you how you do your job. I think the point is that investors are not moral actors. If I be blunt, I could say investors don't know and don't care about animal welfare. The issue that they expect companies to manage, they don't see themselves as being in a position of defining what it is that companies should do, or anything like that. They expect companies to manage this issue as they manage any other sustainability issue, and that's kind of the end of it. When you look at companies, they look at companies in the round. So they acknowledge that some companies have areas of good practice, but they, like you're interested in the corporate entity, and you're interested in the niche specialist way that companies wheel out their sustainability reports. They're interested in how companies manage these issues in the round. These investors are interested in animal welfare as a very instrumental issue. Does it affect cost? Does it affect profit? Does it affect brand? Great opportunity. They know no real interest in the morality of animal welfare. With this project, very few investors really look at animal welfare as a investment risk in and of itself. Most, our time crisis, don't see it as particularly important. The investors who've used the benchmark are using it as a quality of management indicator. Actually, has the effect of making this much more important than a narrow focus on materiality would indicate. Because investors see animal welfare as a new and emerging issue, and I just laugh when I say that. But it's actually, to investors, this is new. Investors look at companies and say, are you aware of this new issue? Are you talking? Are you engaging with your stakeholders on the issue? So investors actually are looking at the benchmark as a quality of management indicator, which is all investment decision making. Is management competent? Is it aware of risk? Is it managing these risks properly? So this is an important signal to companies. And for companies, the message is you need to manage this stuff properly, or investors are going to think badly of you, not because they actually care about animal welfare, that could be that's about it, but because it tells investors a huge amount about your ability to manage sustainability risks more generally. Next slide, please. Investor questioning of companies, the main point I want to make here is that it tends to be relatively high level. Investors who are in the top 2 or 3 tiers, which we describe as companies that have a reasonably integrated report, investors will see that as a hygiene factor. So they would the box and they'll say, unless that company is involved in a controversy or for some reason it needs to look at, that's fine. They won't pay much more attention in most cases. Investors get really interested in poor performers. So companies who are performing badly in the benchmark either suggest they're not reporting or communicating effectively, or actually they have very little in place. So investors feed into their decision-making process under a range of factors, but quite a good indication that the company is not on top of a key risk to the business. Slide, please. This is more of a, again, for those doing investment research, just to flag the benchmark is a financial assessment tool. So it comments on companies' quality of management, but it doesn't comment on their exposure or the materiality of animal welfare. In the ecosystem, investment consultants and others do that kind of research. So this is just an input, a set of insights into quality of management. The really exciting part of this, if I could ask for the next slide, please, David. Okay. The really exciting part of what's going on is that we've, in the last 5 years, encouraging investors to pay more attention to animal welfare, and that's quite successful. What we this year, for the first time, is we've actually asked investors to do something. We've set a collaborative engagement program where investors do things. They write to the companies who appear in the top 2 tiers of the benchmark, commending them on their performance. Now, again, NGOs, is that just greenwashing? Well, actually, it's not. What you want is companies to perform who are performing well to continue to perform well. So it's important that when companies perform well, that there's a process for acknowledging those. But what I'm very excited about is those investors have also written to the bottom 2 companies in the bottom 2 tiers. So it's about 40 global companies, ask them to improve. And we have 16 investors, including EI. So Michelle de Cordova will be speaking later on. They include 3 or 4 U.S. investors, plus investors from the Netherlands, France, and Australia. So, we set up this program 5 years ago. If you said you would have 16 investors with over $1 trillion assets under management engaging with companies and asking them to improve, I would have said we were dreaming. So I think we've seen a sea change. It's early. I think there's lots more that the investment community could do but a signal to companies that this is an issue that now has institutional legitimacy and weight. I think we're at a really important tipping point. And just for my last slide, if I may. So bluntly, most companies are not doing a good job of managing, reporting, communicating on animal welfare. You know, that's the first conclusion. I think, having said, I think the reasons are not just that companies don't care about animal welfare. I think there has been an absence of clear framework defining what it is they should be doing, and the absence of clarity around reporting about what they should do. I think the benchmark is still that gap. I think companies who continue not to report or not to engage actually are really not, now are exposing them to quite serious downside risk from an investment perspective. And that the investment community is waking up to this issue. This is not just a kind of what can be stereotyped as a UK issue where everybody loves their pets. In fact, you have 16 global investors inking with companies, and there are others who are likely to sign up over the next few months. The fact that many investors have used the benchmark as an input to their investment decision-making process, the fact that we had quite extensive discussions with Sustainability, IRIS, MSCI, and others about how they might use the benchmark or the benchmark questions in their process should signal to companies that this is now or will be very soon a mainstream investment issue and one that they need to be prepared to respond to. Thank you much.
Thank you. And it's based on the composition of the room and the folks that are online. It's clear it is a mainstream issue. Just in this alone, we have some folks from Sustainalytics, MSCI is with us in the room as well. And those of you on the phone, just for your benefit, we have Sun Life, other folks from NEI online as well, people from Zero. We also have a very diverse group of farmers and industry associations. We have Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, McDonald's Canada. We have the Turkey Farmers of Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, Egg Farmers of Canada online with us today. Humane Society International, both in the room and online, I see here as well. Representatives from Deloitte, Mountain Equipment Corp. I'm sure looking at this from a textiles perspective as well. So this, from what I'm seeing, it's very clear that this is a mainstream issue. So thank you, Rory. We're going to move over to Fawn Jackson. So Fawn, I mentioned before, is a manager of environment and sustainability with the Canadian Cattle Association, is also the executive director of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. We're hoping to hear from a perspective and from an industry association perspective what animal welfare looks like and what are the challenges in their sector. So I'll turn things on now. Fawn, are you there with us online from Calgary?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody who's on the line. So, action presentation is, oh yeah, okay, I see you're going to fix that little curve there. So, thanks for the introduction. As I said, I work 50% of my time for the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, where I am the environment manager there. And then the other 50% of my time, I work for the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which is a new organization. And animal care and sustainability are truly intertwined with one another. Sustainability, of course, with the three pillars of social, economic, and environmental. Animal care for us on the beef side is really a key part of the social pillar. So going on to the next slide, I always like to give a little bit of background as to who I am. And so these are actually my parents. I grew on a farm in rural Manitoba with beef cattle, and have since worked for the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, as well as a few years of education in there. I do like to give a little bit of background on the Canadian beef industry, so that we have a level understanding of really what the Canadian beef industry looks like. So the average beef cow herd in Canada is 61 head. And so often people think that we have these really large, factory farms, but really the beef cow herd on average is 61 head. And of the cattle that are produced in Canada, about 80% of that beef is processed domestically. So here in Alberta, we have 2 processing plants. In Ontario, we have a couple, and then a number of smaller provincial plants. And most of the beef industry in Canada is out in Alberta. about 40%, and then 30% in Saskatchewan. So that's where it is. I leave this picture of my mom and dad up because, really the average age of the beef farmer in Canada is 54, and so that's something that we're always working towards, is making sure that our industry is something that young people want to come back into. As many of you may have heard, in 2003 we had really 10 years of a tough go following BSE that was discovered here in Canada, and so we're seeing a lot more indicators, economic indicators, for beef producers to come back into the industry now, and it's something that we're always striving to make sure that we have a succession plan in place. We contribute about $33 billion to the Canadian economy, and there's about 68,500 beef producers in Canada. Much of our production is exported, about 31%, and 80% of Canadian farms are family-owned and operated. So it's really good just to set that level playing field as to who the Canadian beef industry really is. So if we go into the next slide, on the overview slide, really I'm going to talk about today is how do we achieve sustainability and animal care outcomes that we're all looking for. How do we do that together? And so I think it's really through four key areas. One, we need to collaborate. Two, we need to have some ground rules or guiding principles. We need to make sure that we're moving animal care forward. And then we also need some tools in place to be able to communicate to our customers and to our investors animal care and how it's being done effectively and accurately here in Canada. I often tell people that I used to focus solely on environment, and this sustainability pile kept on growing and growing to the point where they added sustainability into a job title. And we do have a person who's somebody who's focused on animal health and another person who's focused solely on animal care. But the sustainability topic keeps on growing, and that's because as we see more customers interested in managing their risk and in those discussions around conscious capitalism. And so, as producers, we really want to ensure that people have accurate information on what we're doing on our operations, because our goal, truly is to develop science-based information tools, programs, and policies that help to ensure that Canada's beef cattle producers continue to be recognized as animal care stewards in the world, and that we also maintain a dynamic and profitable industry. And so we are very keen on being transparent about our production practices, Canada, and of course understand that there's a number of intricacies that we need to make sure that are all in place to be able to do that in an effective manner. But really, we have so much in common with groups that are trying to ensure high animal care standards here in Canada, and really it's part of our job is to make sure that we have the things in place to be able to do that. So going on to a slide. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on the National Farm Animal Care Council. So that's the only organization in the world that brings together animal welfare groups, enforcement, government, and farmers under collective decision-making model for advancing farm animal welfare. And this is the group that leads the Beef Code of Practice, and so that's why I have it in here. So really, I think that NFA has a very similar approach to the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. They were up and running long before we were, in that it's extremely important to get a number of stakeholders around the table to come up with how we're going to approach this and have effective decisions in place there. So next, going on to the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Sorry, the next slide. Oh, sorry, and the next one. So the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. In 2010, there were global meetings to start this global roundtable for sustainable beef. And as I mentioned, to deal with companies, but to deal with things such as rainforest, deforestation, animal care, a number of issues that had garnered quite a bit of media attention. And so we came back from that meeting, that global meeting that happened in Denver in 2010 with a multitude of stakeholders on the table and said, you know, a really excellent way to be able to decide what is sustainable beef, you know, come up with a definition for it, and come up with long-term tracking and really be able to move it forward in a continuous improvement manner. And so going on to the next slide, the goal of the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is that through leadership, science, multi-stakeholder engagement, and collaboration, continuous improvement of sustainability of the Canadian beef value chain will be achieved and recognized. And so we both need to make sure that we're being a global leader, but we also need to make sure that our consumers or those interested stakeholders, you know, whether they're investors or sustainability departments in different companies, understand and have the transparency to be able to do that. So to date, we have members and observers. So members, going on to the next slide, include groups from a number of different organizations and companies from a number of different groups. So we have food service and retail, we have environmental and animal care groups, we have processors, we have our beef producer organizations. So we're trying to get a broad spectrum of folks sitting around the table. And what I tell folks is that really it's important not that we have 100% in common, but that we can find that 95 or 98 or 99% that we have in common, and leave the rest at the door and really work towards moving what we do have in common forward. For the observers, those are groups or individuals, academics, you are interested in being involved, governments, and so we have, I think, a really great representative of all the stakeholders who are interested in helping move this forward. And so we have 3 pillars of focus at the roundtable, going on to the next slide. So we decided that, first of all, if we're going to work on sustainability, animal care, of course, being one of the core focuses there, is that we really need to fully understand where we are today. So we've undertaken a national sustainability benchmarking assessment. So much work had been done previously, but really having it in one succinct place, so in one document, to be able to track over the long term is our goal. So that will be completed this in 2016, and then our goal will be to repeat that study every 5 to 8 years. The other part of the work that we're doing is that if a company or a producer so chooses to produce or to supply verified sustainable, that they have a framework within which that they can do that. We're developing both indicators as well as the verification protocols that need to be put in place to be able to do that. So our goal is that sustainability really becomes a pre-competitive issue, so that you're not looking at 2 products on the shelf going, is this sustainable? And this isn't sustainable. No, if you're buying Canadian beef, a number of mechanisms in place to make sure that we are being global leaders in this area. The third pillar of work, which we haven't undertaken yet, is going to be projects to move sustainability forward. So after our national sustainability benchmarking, we might find out, hey, we really want to move forward some areas on animal care or some areas on water stewardship, and so we would undertake specific projects to help reach our targets that we've set through that benchmarking. Moving on to the next slide, I think we have our codes, our laws and regulations, really on which we set the ground rules for how we move this forward. So we have our Beef Code of Practice. It's a collaborative partnership of diverse stakeholders, or in fact is a collaborative partnership of diverse stakeholders who develop this. And so we do have, I think, a couple of people on the line from who are better able to speak to this, but I'll briefly overview it. So if you go to slide 14, a couple forward. What is the Code of Practice for the care and handling of cattle? So it's a guideline and baseline for beef cattle care, helps industry defend acceptable industry practices, And it also helps us to be able to set those ground rules. Going on to the next slide, it can be a resource for new producers, and it can also be the basis for other programs, including on-farm assessment. So just as an example, the Table for Sustainable Beef's indicators are heavily based off of the code. The next slide. So in the code, there's a number of sections, including the environment that they're raised in, feed and water, animal health, animal husbandry, transportation, and on-farm euthanasia. And so it's a really robust document. There's a lot of guidance as to how beef production should be done in Canada. Going on to the next slide, really going back to that collaboration discussion, that it's really important that we have a number of different stakeholders with different viewpoints sitting at the table. So you have animal welfare experts, we have veterinarians, transporters, we have packers sitting there, we have the different government officials, and so really making sure that we have all of the input that we need to make as robust of a document as possible. And so this is a document that the beef cattle industry uses a lot to set those ground rules. So of course, going to the next slide, have laws and regulations in place. And so, federally, we have the Criminal Code, we have the Health of Animals Act, we have the Meat Inspection Act. And since 2005, all provinces have strengthened their provincial acts or have introduced legislative amendments regarding animal protection. So, I think this is really that second pillar. So we have collaboration, we have our codes, laws, and regulations, and then going on to the next slide, we then, move things forward or make sure that we're being leaders in this area. So in Canada, we have the Beef Cattle Research Council, and the Beef Cattle Research Council has invested $1.36 million into welfare research, and so that is not including animal health. That is solely invested into that welfare research, and so it really, I think, important the industry is continuing to invest to develop new practices, new best management practices to make sure that we are doing our best to manage animal care on our operations. And so long-term studies that is done that does audit this, going on to the next slide, is the beef quality audit. So it was first done in 1995, and the intent is to measure quality defects, which could be managed primarily through efforts of cattle producers. And so there are animal care-related topics within that, including horns and branding. And what we've seen going on to the next slide is horns are less common, or becoming less common, and that's managed through genetics. And then also that we want to see dehorning at young ages of cattle. So horns are becoming less common at the packing plant. The next, going to the next slide, ending is also becoming less common. So two painful procedures that we do have guidelines that they do need to be done, have done, but also that we're seeing success on reducing the prevalence of them. And then there's also upcoming welfare research. So I had talked about that $1.36 million invested into welfare research. Going on to the next slide. So looking at castration and how do we make sure that these practices are the best. So how do age, method, pain control affect response to castration? So information such as this will inform future revisions of the Code of Practice and then will be applied on the ground. And going on to the next slide, we've also seen through the beef quality audit that equipment and handling are improving. So this partly be due to, the reduction in bruises will be due to reduction in horns and improvements in the animal care or the animal handling systems that are in place. We've also seen, going on to the next slide, long-term studies on transport benchmarking research. On the next slide. So Karen in Lethbridge has a number of studies with nearly 500,000 cattle and over 9,000 loads of cattle. And what we've seen, going on to the next slide, is that overall 99.98% of short haul and 99.95% of long haul over 4 hours, cattle reach their destination with no apparent problems. And it's really important that we have these tools in place to measure how we're doing on animal care. Another important part is that we're taking that research, so going on to the next slide, so it's the new research that we're developing on, the best methods for castration, or whether it's at what point you should be doing dehorning, is that that information is getting out to our producers. And so the Beef Cattle Research Council does have an extension branch, and they host a number of different events. They just recently hosted a webinar on practical and effective methods of pain control on the farm. We also have, going on to the next slide, another form of extension, so getting out there on the ground to talk to producers. It's called the Verified Beef Production. So it has been an on-farm food safe program, but going forward, we're also adding modules in animal care that will be based off of the Beef Code of Practice, biosecurity, so disease management and environment. So making sure that any of the research advances that we make, that those management practices are getting applied on the ground. And so with the Verified Beef Production Program, they also have a verification tool or option to verify that those practices are being completed. Going on to the next slide, I already talked.
It's Steve in Toronto. I just want to, can you wrap it up on this next slide? We need to move on to our next.
Sure. Thanks. Well, maybe we can go to 42, so the second slide. So last thing that I wanted to talk about was just really how important collaboration is. There's a lot of producer pushback recently from Subway's latest announcement in the United States that they were going to be going antibiotic-free. And the producer pushback on that is that that's a really important tool to actually manage good animal care. So if you have, for example, an animal who has pneumonia or an animal who has something called foot rot, we really need those tools in place to be able to make sure that those animals are free of pain. And so making sure that we're working together so that if a company or investor wants to do something, make sure that you're reaching out to the producer community or the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef to make sure that the work that you do does align. So you become members in the National Farm Animal Care Council or Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and really, reiterating that animal care should be pre-competitive just as food safety is. Make sure your animal care programs align with the Beef Code of Practice and with the Roundtable indicators for sustainability, and really making sure that your marketing doesn't have unintended consequences. And again, really just reiterating that, we have, the same interest as you do to make sure that animal care is done as well as possible here in Canada. So we would be happy to work with you to increase awareness and transparency on that. And just to wrap up, there's my contact information on the last slide, and would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have later on.
So much fun. And if you can stay with us until the end of the session, we can perhaps revisit a couple of those issues and take some questions from those online and in the room. So thanks again.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, we have Dr. Greg Douglas from Maple Leaf Foods. He's the VP of Animal Welfare. I'll let you take from there, and we'll
And just so my background, with Maple Leaf since July, I was the Chief Veterinarian for Saskatchewan and the Chief Veterinarian for Ontario before that. And the federal government, and I, like Fawn, have a background in agriculture as well. My family are still fairly sizable farmers in Saskatchewan. So this is a good example of a corporate example in Canada of a company go the road of significant leadership investment in animal welfare and bring it all together. So that's the presentation goes. So in terms of, next slide, David. So in terms of what we're going to talk about, David gave me a couple of questions, and I'd like to address those. In terms of the context, why is Maple Leaf in this space? I think a couple of reasons. In terms of our values as a company, number one for us is to do the right thing. And this is increasingly a the right thing in both corporate terms as well as societal terms. Number two is, as the largest animal protein company in Canada, we are leaders. We have to be leaders and have to be seen to be leaders, and in terms of animal care, very important. And really, number three, I think, is market imperative. It doesn't go by where we're not getting questions in terms of what's happening in our system. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about our system in the Canadian Maple Leaf from farm all the way to fork. So from that perspective, it's interesting to me because my past was mostly dealing with bureaucracies and stakeholders, and now it's the marketplace and consumers that are asking the questions. So let's just continue on. In terms of just talk a little bit about our company. So we are farmers. Next. Pigs, we produce chickens. We control the feed that goes into our animals, those feedstuffs that go into our animals. We own hatcheries. We barns. We have veterinarians that are taking care of those barns. We have pigs under roof in Manitoba, and we control how they're raised, from what they get, the space they get, the attention they get. So from a standpoint of being involved in farming with farmers, we're also active in the distribution chain. So we interact with those who are bringing animals to processing plants, as well as we have processing plants. Get interests in various parts of the country, in Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario in processing. We're very proud of a lot of the innovation that we've put into our plants lately on a variety of levels. And talk specifically about animal welfare. Food safety is another one of those. Next, David. You can see some of our brands. So what makes us unique in the Canadian context is farmers, we're distributors, we're processors, but we act with you folks on a day-to-day basis with the brands and the imperative that you have in interacting with the people who buy our products. That has been fascinating from my standpoint. In government, we talk about public trust and social license all the time, where the rubber hits the road. This is where we're actually making a difference with people who are asking the questions and needing answers now. And our brands have to reflect our values. And that is interesting because our marketing people are becoming more scientific, if you will, in issues of what are we doing in the barns? How are we using antibiotics? What is a vaccine? Those types of things. And all the corporate entities are becoming more schooled in that area, and I think it's good from a new demographic that has been less agriculture in the past, and the challenge will be whoever is benchmarked the best, answers the questions, their value chain has continuous improvement, systems in place will be the ones that will excel. So just in terms of trends, and next, David, I mean, you've seen all of these are more commonplace in terms of different companies that are either making claims or pronouncements or commitments on either things humane this or environmentally friendly that, giving back to the communities, the whole sustainability file, and that's why you folks are here, because you want to know more about this and holding various parts of the supply chain to account. And we are in the supply chain. We also have a lot of relationships with companies in the supply chain. We're holding those to account. So we play different roles. Slide, David, just on some of the trends that we're seeing and the questions that are coming in terms of some broader animal welfare metrics. And I'm sorry for the small state, but essentially says in the last 3 years we've seen increased interest in animal welfare, specifically of 6 percentage points. And we don't see that going away. That's with a new demographic that is increasingly in tune with how their food is produced. Ask all those questions. We'll continue to develop a program that accounts for all these questions, from the farm level to the processing level, all the way through to the branding level. I think our CEO was asked a question on a podium a week and a half ago in terms of what we need to do in Canada better, and I think his response was, we need to end what we do well in Canada better than we are. We have a good system. I heard Fawn talk a little bit about the codes. The codes in Canada are a national success story in terms of how we develop them collaboratively, with the Humane societies on one side to the associations on the other. And how we collaborate in the future and brand together and communicate together will probably define the Canadian success story, and Maple Leaf will be a big part of that. So there's a slide that just talks about responsible consumption, and just I'm going to talk about our commitment. It was recently approved, but we launched our sustainability website a couple of Fridays ago. I'd urge you to go there and see all the it's there with respect to our commitments and where we're going on a variety of things. As you can see, it's just increasing in terms of the consumers and the pressure to show what we do. And I mean, Rory's point in terms of benchmarking, it's not going to stop at merely an investment benchmark in terms of reporting. We have obligations for stakeholders, NGOs specifically, consumers, industry groups in terms of what we're expecting from them. And in my previous role, it wasn't a day didn't go by where I wasn't pressing on industry as to what their social obligation was on a variety of issues, from biosecurity, antibiotic use, and animal welfare. And I think it's the acuity to all of this is only going to increase. So next slide, and this is our larger commitment on the whole sustainability file, and you see animals fit in. And I'll speak a little bit to the specifics of our program and get down in the weeds a little bit. You're probably a little interested. But our core principles, environment, on working with people. We know that food insecurity in Canada is still a significant entity, and our company is making a commitment to eliminating waste. Tim Favre is our director of environment, and he's all continuing to work on how we eliminate waste throughout our operations. And I think the animal piece fits nicely into the sustainability file, and it's growing. It's probably the last piece from a company standpoint, and now the challenge will be to really make sure it is embedded in the company. And I'll talk about that here in a second. David, next. Just when you asked the question in terms of so why mutual value, and part of the reason we're doing it, mitigate the risk. I do think we will face increased scrutiny, and there's also increased business risk. There's also opportunities on the blue side. We will see more opportunities when we do things well to value and then share that value with the broader community, the investment community, and then obviously to the consuming public. Next slide. So getting more specific. So what are we doing to become a leader? Running a robust program is essentially job one for me, and it'll be involving culture, accountability, transparency, and certainly communicating and the advancement piece. So how we incorporate new practices, new technologies, and I'll talk specifically about some of those. So a robust program, and the culture is certainly one from a company standpoint. I've had the opportunity here in Maple Leaf since I started to go into all farming operations, and the degree of understanding of what has to happen there, I think is important, as Rory suggested, from a corporate standpoint, that programs are comprehensive and they're linked. And a little bit about that. In our auditing and oversight, while I suggested that the advantage is that we develop codes and policies together, we need a better job of auditing together so that one part of the system can support another part. Because I think we have that as well as we should have. There's a lot of different certification programs, and Rory and I have had this discussion before, making the rules on what auditing is and what criteria we look at. And safety has gone down the road of global food safety initiatives with that are kind of common metrics and benchmarks, and animal care isn't there. And so we have, you're seeing an all different certification programs, but myself as a veterinarian, or one who cares about animal welfare, is they haven't necessarily from an outcome standpoint translated in improvements for animals. And so, well, we can report all we want if the program is not fit in actually helping to improve welfare outcomes based on the 5 principles, 5 freedoms of animals, then we're not achieving any aims, our goals. The third, advocating for regulatory reforms, in that space, if you will, as a regulator in 2 processes in the government, and hodgepodge in Canada of regulatory regime for animal care and animal welfare. Provinces, I think, are doing as they can, but they're not harmonized, and they're not linked to codes, and the federal government probably a larger role to play in taking the issue of animal care more seriously. And then committed to transparency, our communications and relationships. And what I'll talk a little bit quickly about how we're planning to report internally. I think it's going to be very important with NGOs, and I've had numerous discussions, and some of the folks are on the phone, and whether it's the industry or folks like you, to continue that conversation on an ongoing basis to give assurances both to the marketplace, to consumers, to folks throughout the system that works. We have emerging issues on a whole host of things in animal health, welfare, and care globally. And whether it's this is an avian influenza situation or antibiotic use, and they're happening quickly. So we're going to have to do a good job of communicating on an ongoing basis. Next slide, David. So just how do we plan to achieve this in Maple Leaf? Established an animal care council have the highest level of participation in the company. It's early days. We plan to continue to grow structure and really embed it in the thing of Maple Leaf, such that on the strategic elements, that care strategy is linked to strategic initiatives in areas, whether they're marketing or growth in a particular value chain or some other areas that we might proceed down animal care as a part of that strategic discussion. Specifically, you'll see some other points: training, mentorship, and coaching. We want to have a cohesive training program on an ongoing basis, and don't let it give you the impression that it doesn't already exist. It's just to be, I think, branded and comprehensive and ongoing in the company to mitigate the risk that that presents. Recognition for employees that are specific to animal care, accountability. I've already reported to the board. That'll become a regular entity, and they're asking those questions, and then linked to other businesses inside the company in terms of different business lines. And then in terms of transparency, the whole notion, I mean, as you know, those who have been operating in space, large companies have been doing far more video auditing inside their plants, so they know what's going on an ongoing basis. And that will be something that I think it'll be important for us to continue to pursue, and how we'll use it. Obviously, it's with coaching, mentorship, and then corrective actions. We need to know it's to other companies. As Fawn suggested, it's a non-compete. I mean, it helps us to understand what's going on in our companies. Our employees are are helped in terms of animals, because it's not as easy and as one would think. And I've said this to other folks in the business, that moving and handling animals isn't just something you learn in a manual. Sometimes it's kind of watching game film in sports. You have to see how things are and how you're operating in order to affect positive change. So I think in terms of how we use that and video inside the company, that'll be very helpful. Advanced technologies, we're all the time. As Fawn talked about the codes are being updated now, comment period in poultry. We're integral on the swine code. And how you move that to the next level of implementation is going to be is very important. And then specific innovations. We are the leader in converting sows to open housing in Canada. Our CEO was the first to make a sizable company to make that commitment, and we've had significant investments that have gone into them to our barns, and we'll continue to do that. And we're pushing the agenda on loose housing, even past gestation crates, to other areas. So, I mean, I'm proud of that. I think it's the right thing to do. I think we're going to find that it's on the production side, it's going to both for us as well. In terms of innovation and research, I mean, I think you heard Fawn talk about the different categories, and I won't go through those in terms of nutrition and lighting and waters and then euthanasias. We're going to have to be at the cutting edge of how we provide those best practices to animals, and then communications, open relationships. We do sit, because of our size, on a lot of industry groups, and we can influence change on codes, on what innovations, what technologies are acceptable. So that's the role. I think that's the aviation of Maple Leaf. David, next. I think I've spoke mostly about this. The cell versions, CO2 and how we're using it. It's in our biggest swine plant in Camden. And then we're leading farm auditing. We audit all our farms in Manitoba per the code, which is, and it's mandatory for all our producers. Transportation side in poultry, it's we do implemented extreme weather protocols such that we're not loading birds in extreme weather. That Canada is pretty commonplace. Governance, that'll be a big part of what I'm mandated to do over the course of the next 6 months. Strategic focus, because I think animal care is going to move from the risk mitigation side to where we can change in a whole host of different areas. It's not just, I mean, I talked about pork and I talked about poultry and turkeys. We use products across the value chain. We use beef products and we use egg products in making of a lot of our value-added products. And usage, that is going to be, this is a significant file, and I think talked a little bit about it from an advocacy standpoint, but the public expects us to use antibiotics judiciously. President Obama made some commitments at the end of 2016. The previous government has followed suit, but it's not as easy as all that. And I know the production system, we're making significant inroads in decreasing antibiotic usage inside of our production system, but as John alluded to, we have an obligation to protect the health and the welfare of animals as we decrease antibiotic use, and that balancing act is something that we will be held accountable for. Metrics, I was asked, it was the second question that Stephen kind of asked me about in terms of what are the performance measures, metrics, and so the challenges. These are the ones that are easy to report, that actually show real outcomes that affect the live animals and who's driving the bus, if you will. As I said, we have a lot of certification programs, but they've for the most part been predicated on, if you'll allow me this license, pet issues of either crates or cages or lighting or things like that. And I think it's going to be more important to have a little bit of a benchmark that allows common people to understand what is going to be important for animals. And the other issue with respect to animals is the human element. And that's so easy, but I think it's going to be something that we're going to have to do in terms of measuring culture and behavior associated with animals. And what that looks like in terms of awareness, enlightenment, and education with those who are in the chain, whether they're killing birds or they're processing animals or they're killing cows. I think it's going to be important for us to be able to measure that and have any easy answers for you there. So that's just, my last slide, David, is just actually our Maple Leaf slide. I'm finished, and that's good. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We're going to move quickly into our last. I apologize to those of you who are on the phone, running a little bit late. If obviously welcome to stay as long as you possibly can, and we will maintain the schedule. We will honor Michelle's presentation, and then we will also open it up Q&A after. So please stay with us. So Michelle Cordova is the Director of Corporate Engagement and Public Policy at NEI Investments. And I pass it over to Michelle. I'm very curious to see how this plays into your world of investment decision making.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Well. Yes, we can hear you well. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you to the previous panelists for what I found very informative presentations. I think Rory's touched on some issues relating to the investor space. So maybe we'll try not to repeat anything that has come before. Rory talked about the investors maybe not coming to this, certainly professionally, from a moral perspective. I think that is largely true. I think we stand in a sort of slightly unusual position at NEI Investments because we run the ethical funds, which is in fact the oldest and the largest of the retail socially responsible investment fund families in Canada. So from our perspective, at the same time, like all investors, whether socially responsible investors or mainstream, very interested in the value proposition relating to animal welfare, the risks and opportunities that are related to the animal welfare question. We in the SRI space also have an interest in what you might call the values concerns too, and that I think might be described as a concern about whether companies are meeting standards that might be emerging in the animal welfare space. So for us, it's a kind of dual concern, a value and a values concern, and it does have the potential to impact the choice of investments, but also for us is a very important consideration with regard to our program of engagement with companies. And like an increasing number of investors, we do have a commitment that we will be engaged and in dialogue with companies in our things about a whole range of environmental and social and governance issues. This is one of the ones that is beginning perhaps to emerge now. So if we're just going to, if I talk briefly perhaps about why animal welfare as an investment concern, our starting point for that is a rather more wide-ranging concern about the risks and opportunities relating to food all the way along the supply chain. So that's certainly, food is certainly the place where we have come into the animal welfare question. There are a whole range of potential issues from an investor perspective. There are that touch on animal welfare, ranging from food safety concerns in this space to regulatory risks that might be companies might be exposed to if they are not able to keep pace with regulations and animal welfare best practices, and obviously reputational risks if they do not satisfy the expectations of the consumer on these issues. So that there's a lot of risk that we see. We also see perhaps some opportunity. We are seeing, certainly in the food beverage space, when it comes to more perhaps nutritionally preferable products. We've seen some interesting research that suggests that those products are increasingly becoming more profitable, potentially more reliable sources of revenue for companies. We've seen that certainly in the nutritional space, but we're also seeing some evidence in the disclosure of companies that might also apply to products that are preferable from a animal welfare perspective. For example, we've seen disclosure from egg producers in the United States about their specialty eggs, including the cage-free eggs, being less cyclical and in price terms than the non-specialty eggs, because of the consumer willingness to pay more for perceived benefits from those products. Just quickly, I think Rory's talked about the business benchmark for farm animal welfare. Another initiative that is emerging that touches on this space in, I would say, very much the mainstream investing space is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Now, this is a U.S. initiative to define metrics and indicators for companies that they might wish to use in their investor-facing securities reporting relating to environmental, social, and governance issues. So this is very much something that's emerging in the mainstream in the United States, but generating a great deal of interest in the investor community around the world because of this focus on issues that are perceived as being material, as really issues that might affect investment decision making and that investors should very much be aware of. Now, SASB has picked up on a number of animal welfare questions in the standards that it has put out for some of the consumer sectors, restaurants, food retailers and distributors, and the meat, poultry and dairy industry. Just to pick a couple of examples there, for example, they have metrics relating to eggs purchased from cage-free sources or pork purchased from gestation-free sources. There are metrics relating to the percentage of production certified to third-party animal welfare standards. If you're interested in this topic, it's well worth digging into the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board materials to see how that is beginning to emerge, as I say, very much in the mainstream of what companies should be disclosing to their investors. Why we want these kind of measures and metrics is really because we want to be able to compare companies as part of our investment decision-making process, and also in order to determine what we should be doing with regard to engagement with companies in the holdings. For everything generally begins with trying to get improved disclosure. Also, that tends to focus in the first stages on policies, management systems, strategy, evidence that companies have strong oversight systems. For example, that the board is focusing on what we consider to be a material issue. That it's not just people in the sustainability area of the company that are struggling against the company to advance something, but that it has really been kind of absorbed into the business strategy of the company. From we will hope to see, as things develop, indicators that tell us more about the performance of company against these issues. then hopefully we'll begin to get information that really that we can really think about in the investment process. I would say that, for example, indicators such as the company's exposure to more or less preferable products in the animal welfare space, that I could see as being a very interesting type of indicator for us to assess whether their likely exposure to other kinds of regulatory or reputational risks in space. So maybe just to finish up, I will mention, go back to the business benchmark for farm animal welfare, which we do, as Rory mentioned, we are supportive of that. We think it's helpful. We always find these kind of benchmarking initiatives very helpful in that it helps us to sort of pick out which companies we might wish to give more attention to in engagement, and also be aware of which companies might be stronger on this issue. We do like the fact that this is a banded benchmarking. I always find those a little preferable to the ranked lists, because often there's not a lot of difference between number 1 and 2 on a ranked list, or between number 8 and 9, or between number 16 and 17. The issue is that there's a difference between number 1 and number 17. So by banding, then you're getting a sort of overall impression of how people are handling certain issues. I think it may be even more helpful for those within the company not to feel that they're struggling to wrest position number 2 from a different company, or being criticized because they didn't number 1 or didn't move up to number 3, but they're being recognized in general for how they are, what kind of level of attention they are giving to a particular issue. What we like to see in the future from benchmarking activities is some more Canadian content, because we are quite exposed to Canadian companies, and bringing companies into benchmarking processes is extremely useful for investors. We hope to see emerging clarity on norms and labels. I think it was very interesting to hear more about sustainable beef work earlier on the call, but well accepted norms and standards are a very helpful proxy for investors to get an idea of how companies are handling certain issues. So that's certainly work that we think is very important. And on the research side, people are out there doing research, evidence of how the animal welfare question and addressing animal welfare questions might be beneficial for companies in terms of their profitability, the engagement of their staff, the value of the brand, et cetera, et cetera. That is always very interesting reading for investors. And just one final point. I've gone rather quickly to try and help us keep to time here, but please consider all the stakeholders who are involved in this work. Please remember that the investors are out there. That though we may not always be the experts on a topic, we are impacted by it, and we impact the companies that are affected by topics. So making us aware of what is happening in the animal welfare space, making us aware of consultations and discussions that are going on in this space, that is very helpful to us, and enables us to play our part in moving this issue forward. Thanks.
Wonderful, Michelle, and thank you for being conscious of time and speeding through. I sensed that you were doing your part. And thank you for your curiosity and leadership on the issue. And I heard your call to action for more Canadian content and engagement, and I'm looking around the room, and I'm hoping this is the beginning of one of many conversations, so thank you for that. The original plan was to go from 2 to 2:15 for questions. We've run a little bit over, but we do have some time now. I think maybe what I'd like to do is give priority to the folks that are online, because we have the folks in the room here for some questions afterwards. So at this time, if you can look on your Cisco WebEx screen in the webinar, to the bottom right, there is a Q&A feature that you can expand. Able to put questions in there above and beyond technical questions for David as he's setting up the webinar. But if you do have any questions for the panelists or just in general, now would be a good time to present those questions. And if you're a little shy about asking questions, you can always follow up with us directly, and we can field some of those questions offline for you. Happy to do that. And also, I should mention that this webinar will be zipped up and redistributed pending approval from all of the panelists. So we'll be able to share some, if not all, of the content with you after the fact. Okay, we have questions coming in. So, David, is that the first question that there are? Okay. So, given that there are 90 companies that are part of the BBFAW, Business Benchmark Farm Animal Welfare, how is the data collected? Is it self-reported, or is there an external, impartial third party that assesses each company? Want to jump in?
Let me. The benchmark is based on published information from all of the companies. The process is we have a number of assessors who evaluate the companies. They go through each question and they fill out a sort of a detailed assessment which says what's the information provided, where is it found, how have we scored it the way we've scored it. We then have parts of the quality assurance on that. We send the results to companies so they can fact check it. So it's not a negotiation process, but it's so in case we've missed anything or misinterpreted what the company has said. We also, because we work closely with World Animal Protection and Compassion World Farming, and in fact I have Olia, who's a member of our technical working group, and Darren Vanstone, who has had the delight of reviewing some 20 or 30 company reports this year. So both those organizations review the findings as well, just to check that they make sense, align with their understanding of the businesses and of their positioning. We necessarily revise the scores, although, you know, I think now that we're 4 years in, we find that we take pretty good at getting the right answer the first time, and then analyze the results at that point. So the process is published information, review the company for factual accuracy as sensed by the partner NGOs, leading to some evaluations, which we then, you know, synthesize, analyze, write up, and so forth.
Thank you. A question, Jackie from NFAC, is sort of a spin, but I think there might be a question and an opportunity for Greg to comment. To Greg's point on the need for an overarching direction on animal care assessments, NFAC has developed an animal care assessment framework that provides a nationally coordinated process to develop programs. How we do need to tell our story better. Do you want to expand on that?
Well, and Jackie is the authority on the national programs, and thank you for the point, Jackie. I think in the Canadian context, and Maple Leaf, I think support this. We're a small country, and we have had a significant amount of success on the code process, and the industry developed a lot of their programs from the code, and they've been very successful at getting onto the farm. So that framework has been relatively successful. Now, from an industry perspective, from a corporate perspective, from a national perspective, do we send companies, countries, industries in this responsible vein and get credit for it from a risk standpoint? I think that's going to be the challenge, and I think it's going out to all the industry folks on the phone that it's we have been successful to date, but the pressure is going to mount in terms of not telling our story. I mean, we can tell good stories, but showing what we're doing on farms in the processing system effectively with the programs that are in place. So, to point, the National Farm Health and Welfare Health Care Council, enough acronyms in this country, for the most part by AAFC, but a large group now. Probably industry, even retail has recently joined the group associated with those to help continue to move that along positively. So investors look at what companies are doing from a bench and risk mitigation standpoint and the like. I think from a Canadian as well as a corporate standpoint, we can move the chains very quickly through initiatives like hers and for companies to be engaged in that.
I saw you chime in as well.
I would, because I think this opens up an issue that has been a bugbear of investors for a long time, which is the problem of multiple standards and inconsistencies between standards. An outsider visiting Canada and as a guest in your country and being and wanting to thank you for your generosity, I'm quite amazed at how many standards and how regional and actually parochial much of what's going on is. I mean, I think my view is that actually this is a question for national standards. I think that's actually the agenda. I think it's not just about quality. The discussion that I've had over the last few days in Canada has been about ensuring the quality of Canadian products. Actually, these standards need to explicitly deal with animal welfare. If you want to see Europe, quality is the picture, welfare is integral to that. And I would say that it's not just about having one standard, or a national framework. It's about having welfare. It's about ensuring that those are properly audited, insured, and verified. And I think there's a real opportunity for Canadian producers, but also I acknowledge that question of national, including high standards of animal welfare and audit and assurance, is a challenge. But I think it's the agenda we should all be talking about next.
I just want to be conscious of both Fawn and Michelle online if they'd like to chime in on that. David, is it possible to Michelle, Fawn, you're actually live. If you'd like to further comment on that, you're ready to go.
I think that was really, the goal with the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef was to develop a national dialogue on sustainability as a whole, so that we don't have a number of different stakeholders working on it in separate little pockets. And so really to work on it together, and then also to really utilize the work that's already out there. So the great work that the National Farm Animal Care Council has done to really utilize that and bring awareness to it more, both on the ground, but also, where other stakeholders are sitting around the table. So, I agree with you that it's really important to have a national approach, and that's, the direction that we're headed.
Great. Do you have any parting?
I just wanted to add that certainly the proliferation of standards is very challenging for investors who are not necessarily the biggest experts on these topics. What they're looking for is something that seems to be well accepted, that seems to be addressing key risks, and that could have a positive impact for a company. So definitely that collaboration to establish norms and standards that are generally accepted would certainly be helpful in the investor space. I think there'll be an element also that certainly for the export markets, that to some extent the brand that there is that has potential for success for the companies to a great extent internationally. Probably the brand is Canada that we are talking about. So Canadian-wide standards then become very interesting in that context.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think this is going to have to be our last question for the day, at least for the folks joining us online. And then we're reconvening here for another discussion. Last question: is there any work going on to create a global animal welfare sustainability standard? Has the textile industry been engaged at all? And I think we're going to reach over to Darren Vanstone from WPA for that.
Okay, this is working. I think the difficulty on a global scale is the same view that we were just talking about here in Canada. A lot of different standards in place. There's a global table for sustainable beef. There's some work around sustainable soy. There's all these other things. I don't think there's a single process to attempting to bring sustainability and animal welfare together. So that's not happening. And based on that answer, I think I could suggest that maybe the textile industry has not been engaged. A suggestion would be that the textile industry, especially when it comes to leather, would probably be a great partner for the Canadian Roundtable on Sustainable Beef and the Global Roundtable. So where the textile industry is impacted by, depending on species, I think there are probably species-specific engagements out there that they could be a part of.
I think it's important for us to respect everyone's time and wrap things up for the webinar portion of today. So I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank all of our participants online and here in the room. I want to thank Cisco for offering the technology to connect us all together, and the Ontario Investment and Trade Centre for hosting us here today. So thank you, and please send us any follow-up questions you have, and as I said, we will be following up with a copy of this presentation in the weeks ahead, so you'll see that shortly. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.